Hey, what's up? This is Mr. Ippolito, and today we are going to go over Chapter 9, Section 1 and Chapter 9, Section 2. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to go over the things that I think are the most significant and kind of point out the things that I think will be helpful when you're taking your quiz and just also helpful for better understanding our Manifest Destiny unit. So we're going to start off right here with Chapter 9, Section 1. The first thing it talks about is what was the West, trying to define what the West was, right? And this is a really good vocabulary term right here, frontier. So the frontier is constantly changing. This is something we actually address in the video notes for the America Story of Us video that you either have watched or you're about to watch. So the land that forms the farthest extent of a nation's settled regions, that's the frontier. As far as we have gone, that is the frontier. So if you take a look at this like political map here, right? This was originally our frontier when we were colonies. The line that pretty much extended along the Appalachian Mountains, right? This was our frontier. And then eventually we started pushing the frontier beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Britain, when we were still British colonies, told us not to, but Americans are really good for disobeying orders and breaking rules and for not wanting to be constrained and confined. So the frontier pushes further and further west, the longer time goes on, history goes on. So eventually, the Mississippi River became the frontier, and then as we started to acquire more lands, as we are studying in this unit, we acquire the Louisiana Purchase, and then eventually we're going to acquire Oregon Country and the Mexican Cession here, and so all of those lands over time, as we keep pushing further and further out to the west, are going to become the American frontier. Okay, then this section talks about the Great Plains. It talks about how the Great Plains were not really good, or at the time, in the early 1800s, it was difficult to plow the land, to kind of dig it up and turn it into something like farmland. And so these are the Great Plains right here, kind of the center section, which if you take a look on this map, is pretty much the Louisiana Purchase. So what this section is talking about is as settlers begin to move beyond the Mississippi River, they're really not stopping here. They are not wanting to settle down here in the Great Plains. They're really trying to get out to the west, to land that at the time in the 1820s, 1830s, we didn't even own yet. So they were trying to get out to places like California. They were trying to get out to places like Texas, as we will learn more about. They were trying to get out to places like Oregon along the Oregon Trail. So that's really what this is talking about right here. Like it would have just been too difficult to try to break up that really hard soil of the Great Plains. So that wasn't really a destination for Americans at that time. So we move on, and then it talks about the Northwest and the Southwest. So the Northwest would refer to the area beyond the Rocky Mountains, Oregon and Washington right here, this part right here. And then the American Southwest, we're including California. What will become the New Mexico territory today is the states of Arizona, New Mexico. And I think for the purpose of this unit, probably also talking about Texas as the Southwest as well. So that's what we're talking about here in this section. So then the textbook shows you a map of North America in 1830. These are the states that have already been admitted to the United States. You can see that we are growing as more states grow. But still, we do not own, by 1830, we do not own any of this land here. We do, Oregon Territory, we have a claim on it, but Great Britain also has a claim on it as well. So eventually, we're either going to need to go to war or to have some sort of treaty or agreement to settle what's going to become of Oregon. So then we move into, the textbook starts talking to us about Mexican settlements. So we learn a little bit about that and about how this land right here was all originally owned by Spain. Spain was one of those superpowers of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. But then there's a revolution in 1821. And so all of this land that you see right here goes from being owned by Spain to becoming the new independent country of Mexico. So that's all of this land right here. And that's what this is talking about right here, and kind of how culturally the Spanish and they are marrying and having children with the Native Americans and with Native Africans, all kind of intermarrying together and creating this distinct Southwestern culture. Then a little bit more about Native Americans, the Spanish missionaries. We're going to be learning more about Father Junipero Serra, Father Serra, if you remember, is the founder of the California Mission System. You probably learned about that in fourth grade. We're going to be learning about him a little bit more. Talking about the toll that the mission system took on the Native American population. They were basically forced into what could be described as slave labor or forced labor on the California missions. Additionally, the Spanish brought disease. They brought it took a very negative toll on the Native Americans, and so you'll read about that and the contributions of Native Americans and the contributions of the Spanish and kind of this this blending of cultural traditions here. I mentioned Mexico winning its independence and how this talks about how the land grant system would change under Spanish rule to the ranchero system in Mexico. And so Mexico was encouraging the old land grant system. Really only the very wealthy could own land under Spanish rule. But under the ranchero system in Mexico, they were really encouraging land ownership by like a middle class, right? So this is ultimately going to draw Americans into this part of Mexico right here, which is going to become Texas. And eventually those American settlers are going to outnumber the original Mexican settlers in there by 10-1. And so that's what's going to lead to the Texas War for Independence, which you're going to watch about a little bit in the video, and then we'll learn more about later on. So that's this section here. And then finally, the last part of Chapter 9, Section 1 is talking about manifest destiny, defining manifest destiny. We were interested in expansion, right? Constantly pushing our borders, pushing our frontiers so that we are trying to acquire more and more land. First, the Louisiana Purchase, that's like our first major real estate deal as the United States. And then we get this quote right here by John L. O'Sullivan in 1845, which tells us what manifest destiny is, right? Manifest destiny is the belief that the United States should extend to the Pacific Ocean. That's really what manifest destiny is, or from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So that is now the end of Chapter 9, Section 1. And then now that will take us to Chapter 9, Section 2, where we start to get specifically into some of those trails to the west. So again, the background knowledge, which we already know about, Europeans, the earliest Europeans in North America were those Christian missionaries who were coming because they wanted to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And so we're going to be looking at those missionaries as well as other groups of people and looking at the push-pull factors. Like, in other words, what pushes people to move away from where they came from, their old homes, and what is pulling them to their new homes in different parts of what will become, the expanded frontier of the United States. So start off Chapter 9, Section 2, talking about the Santa Fe Trail. And I probably should have had this pulled up in advance, but Manifest Destiny Trails map. I'll pull that up. And there are a number of different, this is open image in new tab. There we go. And I think this has the Santa Fe Trail. Looks like it does. We'll zoom in a little bit on this so you can see this. So this is just one, the Santa Fe Trail is just one of many trails out, always heading in a westerly direction. This one happened to leave from Independence, Missouri, the kind of the western border of Missouri, and heading along. A lot of times you try to find a body of water to follow, and then eventually ending up in Santa Fe, what will later be New Mexico territory. Well, originally, we go back here, in 1821, it was still part of Spain. And then the Mexican Revolution happened, and then we become a part of Mexico. And then ultimately it would be taken over by the United States after the Mexican-American War, will become New Mexico territory, and then ultimately the state of New Mexico. So that's the Santa Fe Trail. Let's move now into the Oregon fur trade. In our video on America, the Story of Us, we learned about beavers and the importance of beavers and beaver fur and the beaver trade, and so you're going to read more about that. These mountain men, these young, some of them did it for 10, 20, 30 years, eventually became older men, but these mountain men could make enormous amounts of money by trapping the beavers, killing them, skinning them, taking their furs, and then selling those furs to these furriers, coat manufacturers, blanket manufacturers on the East Coast, and they could get so much money for those furs. So you're going to read all about that. Here's another. So mountain men, that's a vocabulary term. Rendezvous. It's where these trappers, these mountain men would meet and trade furs for supplies. So you'll read all about that. This is either John Jacob Astor or just some fancy guy in a beaver, fur-lined cloak. So a little bit there. So again, looking at those push-pull factors. Why did mountain men travel to Oregon? What was the pull? Well, the pull was the lucrative beaver trade. Lucrative means you can make a lot of money. And then we have another group of people that came to Oregon, and these were the missionaries. So you're going to read the story of Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, about how they came to spread Christianity to the Native Americans, the Cayuse Indians, in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, Washington, in Oregon territory, right? So in this case, we're talking about this area right up here, the Columbia River Valley, this area, Oregon territory. So you're going to read about them, and they didn't have a very happy ending. And then you're going to learn about the Oregon Trail. So I definitely want you to read that and find out what was so dangerous about the Oregon Trail. And you should be asking yourself the question, why did families, these were not, for the most part, these were not poor families who had nothing. These were families who owned homes, who owned farms, who willingly sold that stuff or gave a lot of their possessions away, sold their farms, sold their homes to move 2,000 or 3,000 miles out west. Let's take a look at that Oregon Trail there. And most of them would leave out of Independence, Missouri. The green is the Oregon Trail, and they would travel this very treacherous route across the Rocky Mountains, through the deserts of the Great Basin, over through the Cascade Mountains, and then ultimately to the area in and around Portland, Oregon, and other areas of the Oregon Territory. So you should be thinking, as you're kind of reading this, and what were the dangers and why were they willing to put themselves in such danger? So you get to learn all about the Oregon settlers there, the pioneers along the Oregon Trail, how they kind of lived and how they coped and how they survived and how they supported each other. So you want to read all about that. Here's some examples of some things that you might find in a wagon. Again, the wagons, these covered wagons that the pioneers took to go to places like Oregon Territory, for the most part, you don't put people in them. They are not designed for human transport. They are designed for all of your stuff, right? So they're really just built like you pack them to the brim. And if someone can't walk, they're injured, they're sick, then they might ride in just a small portion, passenger portion of the wagon. But really, for the most part, you want everybody walking, because the heavier load you have in that wagon, the more strain you put on your oxen, your draft animals that are pulling your wagon. And if one of your oxen has a heart attack and falls over and dies, well, then you're really in trouble. So read about that. There's a map of those trails to the west that you can check out. And then just some other examples of how life was difficult for these pioneers, who not only had to endure the travels, but then they had to endure hardships once they finally got into wherever they were going, whether it's California or Oregon. Also would like for you to take note of women in the West. We're going to be talking about pioneer women and their strength that they had. And so you can start to kind of be introduced to that here. The interactions between Native Americans and settlers. And that is then the end of Chapter 9, Section 2. So I hope you enjoyed our overview and kind of deep dive into Chapter 9, Section 1 and Chapter 9, Section 2. And I will look forward to seeing you next time so we can take a quiz, learn more, explore more, and learn more about the history of the westward expansion period of Manifest Destiny in United States history. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.